Here's a story from Grandpa for my three favorite little girls, Emma, Ayla, and Audrey. Back in the olden days, long before even I was born, there weren't as many books around as there are now. So what people used to do is they would tell each other stories. Some stories would become very popular and people would tell them over and over again. They might have started out as a true story about a real person, but as the stories were told and retold, the story would often change into something very different, something more satisfying to hear. We call these stories folk tales, and there's a special category of folk tales called tall tales, in which everything about the story becomes exaggerated. The hero is bigger and stronger and smarter than anyone could possibly be, and he or she does outlandish things that no one could ever possibly do, but it makes a good story that is fun to listen to, so it is a tall tale. We have lots of stories like these from the early days of our country. Stories about characters named John Henry and Mike Fink and Calamity Jane and Johnny Appleseed. I loved hearing all these tall tales when I was growing up, so I hope that you will like them too. Today we're going to start with the story of a lumberjack who may or may not have actually existed, named Paul Bunyan. Growing up, Paul Bunyan was always big. When he was born, his first cries broke every window for miles around. And that was only the beginning. His crib was a rowboat with rockers, and his baths flooded the house until his parents gave up and started washing him outside. But Paul wasn't done growing, not by a long shot. It took the wool from a whole flock of sheep just to knit him one sweater. By the time he started to school, he wore potato sacks for socks and used wagon wheels to button his shirts. Of course, so much growing made Paul hungry. He ate 40 bowls of porridge for breakfast, and by the time he was done cleaning up, he was hungry all over again. Paul spent a lot of time in the woods. He made friends with many animals, especially the beavers. Only the bears got mad at him because whenever they wrestled him, Paul always won. Still, some things were hard for Paul. He tried to fit in, but it wasn't easy. The other children could play with him better than he could play with them. When Paul was 15, the winter was so cold even the snow turned blue. One morning, Paul found a young ox half buried in the snowdrift. If that wasn't odd enough, the ox was as blue as the snow itself. "My poor little Babe," he said, and that's how Babe got his name. Paul never found out where Babe came from, but it didn't matter. Paul was just happy to have a new friend. Babe was really strong. In one of their first jobs, Paul hitched him up to a crooked road that needed fixing. "Pull," he said, and Babe pulled. The road was pretty stubborn, but so were Paul and Babe. By the time the sun set, they had that road straightened out just fine. "Good work," Paul said to Babe, and Babe snorted back. They made a good team. Starting out, Paul was always comfortable holding an axe. With his very first swing, he cut down a half-grown pine tree. He used it to brush his hair until the needles fell out. When he got older, Paul decided to be a lumberjack. At first, he only had Babe to help him. Paul cut down the trees and Babe pulled them into stacks beside the river. But there was more work to be done, more than even Paul and Babe could do. So Paul hired himself a crew. His most famous workers were his 7 axemen, all named Elmer. Each Elmer weighed over 300 pounds and was over 6 feet tall sitting down. The Elmers didn't chop wood with regular axes. They worked faster, twirling the blades around them. Johnny Inkslinger kept track of things in the logging camp office. There was so much figuring to be done, he invented a pen connected directly to an ink barrel. That way he didn't lose time filling it up every minute or so. One week, Johnny was short of ink, and he saved 12 barrels by not crossing his T's or dotting his I's. Lucy, the purple cow, gave Paul milk, cheese, and butter. She was happy as long as the grass was green, but green grass was hard to come by in cold weather. So during the winter months, Paul had Lucy wear green glasses to make the snow look like grass. Sourdough Sam, the cook, fed Paul's logging crews. Sam's soup kettle was so big he had to row a boat out to the center. At dinner, his cookhouse boys wore roller skates to get from one end of the dining tables to the other. The Axemen ate hundreds of flapjacks, which are pancakes. Sourdough Sam was always running out of space to make them, so old the blacksmith made a new griddle. A dozen men skated on bacon slabs to grease it. At first the flapjacks in the middle were too hard to reach. Then Sam added popcorn to the batter so the flapjacks flipped themselves. It was a good thing Paul and his men kept up their strength. They faced some strange things in the wilderness. One time they floated some logs down the Round River. They didn't give the name much thought, but pretty soon they noticed that they were going in circles. Paul was starting to get dizzy, so he dug out the center of the river and turned Round River into Round Lake. Another time the loggers were buzzed by mosquitoes as big as eagles. Their stingers were very nasty. Paul finally swatted them all out into the ocean. They got lost there and never found their way back. The year of the 2 winters. It was always cold in the winter. The lumberjacks were used to that, but one year was much colder than the rest. Maybe Paul should have seen it coming. The leaves that fall didn't turn red or yellow. They turned dark blue from the cold. Once the snow started falling, it just wouldn't quit. At first, the lumberjacks cut new paths through the fresh snow every day, but after a while they let the snow pile up, and they dug tunnels under it instead. After a month, the snow got so deep Paul had to dig down just to find the treetops. Looking back, they called it the year of the 2 winters. By January, the icicles had reached the ground and started to take root. Shadows froze against the walls and couldn't get loose. Lucy's milk turned to ice cream before it hit the pail. And lighting fires was no good because the flames froze solid. They were pretty to look at, but they weren't worth a lick for warmth. Of course, things weren't all bad. It was so cold even the bed bugs huddled together to keep warm. Scooping them up was quick and easy, so the lumberjacks had clean sheets for once. Nobody got any work done because keeping warm was pretty much a full-time job. The lumberjacks let their beards grow and grow and grow. They wrapped them around like scarves. Even the snowmen needed more clothes than usual. When spring came, Paul cut everyone's beard. The whiskers were stacked up and later stuffed into mattresses. The cracking of the ice went on for weeks. The only person who got any sleep wore 3 pairs of earmuffs to bed. But nobody complained. They were just glad things were back to normal. Moving on. Paul and Babe were happy the long winter was over. After being cooped up for so long, they were eager to stretch their legs. Paul hitched a plow to Babe, and they dug a groove from Round Lake down to the Gulf of Mexico. As the water rushed south, it made a nice wide river. Paul called it the Mississippi. He piled the dirt neatly on one side. There were a lot of stones and boulders mixed in. When he was done, he called the whole pile the Rocky Mountains. On their way back north, Paul and Babe walked through the desert. It was terribly hot, and Paul took to dragging his great axe behind him. The heavy axe cut deeply into the soft sand. At sunset, Paul turned to look behind him. "What a grand canyon," Paul said, and the name stuck after that. Back home, Paul found his loggers scratching their heads. They had piled too many logs into the river. Now the logs were stuck in a mile-long jam. Paul thought over the problem a minute. Then he told everyone to stand back. He put Babe in front of the jam and tickled his back with a pine tree. Babe thought a fly was bothering him and flicked his tail back and forth. Each time his tail hit the water, it sent a wave crashing against the logs. They were jarred loose 10 at a time, but it still took 3 days before the last of them broke free. Paul and his lumberjacks kept so busy that one day there were no more trees worth cutting down. Some of the loggers liked the look of the cleared land and decided to settle down, but not Paul. He needed more elbow room, so he and Babe said goodbye to the loggers and headed out west. No one knows where they ended up, and Paul was careful not to leave any footprints behind. But every time you see a big mountain or a deep canyon or a rushing river, you know these things don't happen by themselves, so it's a pretty good bet that Paul Bunyan was there before you. And that's the end of the story. Back in the beginning of this country, there were a lot of lumberjacks around whose job it was to cut down trees. The country was full of trees back then, and they were cut down for the wood that was needed to build houses and to clear the space needed for cities and farms. In this story, Paul Bunyan is the biggest lumberjack who ever lived, who could do things no other human being could possibly do. As I read you the story, you could probably identify most of the things that were exaggerated that could not have possibly happened, but it made a good story, didn't it? And wouldn't it be pretty if it were true? Always remember that Grandpa loves you. I'm not exaggerating, and I hope to see you soon. Bye-bye.